Now is the time to pay attention to the back of the room. This is the main stage. Hi, everybody. Oh, I see some people in this page. Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy. I came up with this idea for this festival. I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm glad you're all here. And so, welcome to the first annual Circuits in the Woods electronic music performance here in Brattleboro, Vermont. Thank you all for coming. So when I first came up with this idea to do this festival, I thought, oh, you know, there's so many people who have interesting things to say about electronic music. Some of those people are electronic music pioneers, and some of those people are a little newer to the situation. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to have like some lectures and some panel discussions or something like that, as well as a lot of musical performances. And one of the things I thought about was, wouldn't it be interesting to have some sort of discussion or presentation about the intersection between queer identity and electronic music? And so I was, as one does, at the cheese counter at the Brattleboro Food Co-op, buying way too much cheese. And I mentioned this to our next presenter, and they said, I'm just gonna do the whole presentation, forget about a panel discussion. I said, well, okay, you are now signed up. That person is Caldon Glover, who's gonna come up and talk to us. With musical examples about the queer history of industrial music. So stick around and let us give another round of applause for Caldon Glover.
Hello, I'm Caldon Glover, they, them. Public speaking isn't my forte, so I'm going to be extensively looking at my notes and trying to pretend none of you are there. So don't take it personally, it's not you, it's me. So when Wendy was first telling me about this, I don't know if you want to call it a festival or like an exhibition, she was concerned that the experimental community overall was too much of a sausage fest, to which I said yes, but also, from my own experiences, experimental communities all over the country are often havens for LGBTQ people. For example, when I was living in Tucson, I played a show where the entire bill was made up of trans and non-binary people, and it wasn't organized that way. It's just when you pull 4 names out of the Arizona noise scene hat, it's not that unlikely that all of those people are going to be queer. And I think there are a lot of reasons that queer people are so involved in contemporary experimental music, and I'll get to that near the end of the presentation. But I think it begins with what I hazard to call the first noise scene, the first wave of industrial music. When I say industrial, most people, well maybe not you guys actually, you probably all know what I'm talking about, but most people probably think, I don't know what you're talking about. But even people who are familiar with the term probably think of something like 9 Inch Nails, or maybe Rammstein, or Ministry, if they've gone a little further down the rabbit hole. But generally speaking, when someone says industrial, the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds are these bands doing kind of like a hard rock with some electronic elements, usually made up of, you know, manly men singing songs about angst or personal hardship, kind of like a Nirvana with synthesizers. But it wasn't always this way. All right, I'm gonna play a little sound. Are we good to go?
Probably.
excerpt of Hamburger Lady by Throbbing Gristle, the first industrial band. Hell yeah. Let's say officially, industrial music began in the mid-1970s, most prominently in central England, with some notable exceptions in the United States and Australia. And it started gaining prominence around the same time as punk. And there are some similarities between the two scenes, especially like aesthetically, visually, and both scenes had a heavy emphasis on a DIY kind of ethos. But industrial and punk were actually pretty distinctly different phenomenons, if I do say so myself. One of the big differences was ideological. I would categorize punk around that era as being sort of a materialist movement in the Marxist sense, concerning itself with poverty and working class issues and war, whereas industrial was very much concerning itself with the existential. And what I mean by that is, consider the first industrial band, Throbbing Gristle, was made up of Genesis P-Orridge, a trans person, Peter Christopherson, a gay man, Cozy Fanny Tutti, I think I'm saying that right, a woman who incorporated her job as a sex worker into her art, and Chris Carter, who was the token straight guy. So this band is made up predominantly of people who were being told by society, especially the increasingly conservative society of 70s England, that they shouldn't exist, and this was very central to their work. S. Alexander Reid, author of Assimilate, a critical history of industrial, puts it like this. What happens when you're protesting for your right to be whole and complicated and your indefinite self, and when the forces that keep you from doing so might not even be aware that they're doing that? The other thing that made industrial very distinct from punk was that industrial didn't begin as a music movement. Throbbing Gristle was an evolution of a multimedia performance art group called Calm Transmissions, which I also don't think I'm saying right because I've only seen it written down, who created intentionally confrontational exhibitions that combined collage and sculpture and found art and sound art that were meant to be very confrontational and subvert what the members of Calm saw as societal expectations for things like sex and the perception of British decency. They gained particular notoriety when a member of Parliament called them wreckers of civilization after their exhibit Prostitution at the London Institute for Contemporary Art. Throbbing Gristle sort of branched out from the sort of more sonic element of Comb, and even though it kind of pretty quickly became the sole focus of the group, it is worth noting that none of the members had any background in music. Rather than stemming from prior musical movements, the industrial movement as a whole was more heavily inspired by counterculture figures in the literary and art worlds, with bands citing influences from Marcel Duchamp and Marquis de Sade. Two figures in particular had an overwhelming influence on the first wave of industrial, which were the beat poet William S. Burroughs and the notoriously flamboyant occultist Aleister Crowley, respectively gay and bisexual men. Burroughs was sought out for his uncompromising writings on homosexuality and addiction and people existing in the margins of society, as well as novel methods of repurposing existing works to create surreal and sometimes disturbing subversions of the dominant culture of the times. And Crowley appealed to many in the industrial scene due to his very theatrical but seemingly sincere attempts to find deeper meaning in the world through magic, sexual experimentation, and esoteric writing. Queerness wasn't the only driving force behind the early industrial scene. Really, the movement was preoccupied with anything that kind of poked and prodded. I'm trying to talk and drink water at the same time. Hold on. Woo. Where was I? Really, the movement was preoccupied with anything that sort of poked and prodded at the fractures of the dominant conservative culture of England, and it's worth noting that as this was gaining prominence, so too was Margaret Thatcher. As I mentioned before, Cozy Fanny Tootie worked as a sex worker and strove to destigmatize her work by incorporating it into her art through video and photography and collage, something she talks about extensively in her book, Art, Sex, Music, which is a fantastic read. Another example is Throbbing Gristle has a whopping 18-minute long song called Very Friendly that is about the Moors murders and kind of contrasts the horrors of the murders with the seemingly mundane lives of the perpetrators who, until they were caught, just appeared to be regular, upstanding British citizens. So I've been talking a lot about Throbbing Gristle up to this point because they were key figures in the first wave of the industrial scene, indeed coining the term industrial music. But despite this, the band was actually relatively short-lived. Retrospectives about the band, both from the members and from people close to them, make it pretty clear that, by all accounts, Genesis P. was a very abusive and manipulative and extremely self-centered person, and this led to the group kind of dissolving in just over 4 years. Everybody went on to kind of do their own very cool, very creative things. Chris Carter and Cozy went off to form Chris and Cozy, and they're still recording music to this day, as far as I know. And Peter Christopherson joined his partner, John Balance, and formed the band Coil, just right after the same year that Throbbing Gristle disbanded. And so I had to be very careful writing this part because I could talk all day about Coil. I will talk about them until Wendy drags me off the stage, so I'm doing my best to control myself here. Coil was made up of the core duo of John Balance and Peter Christopherson, who were life partners until John's death in 2004. And the rest of the band was made up of sort of a rotating cast of people who drifted in and out over the course of the 20 years that the band was active. And they were very crucial to the development of kind of later post-industrial genres because they had a really broad palette of sound they played with. They separated their kind of sound into two distinct phases. The first phase they refer to as their solar phase, which I'm going to play an example here. So this was a more clearly very beat-driven, rhythmic, pretty noisy, pretty stark, but more energetic kind of sound. And that sort of sound palette became very common in the industrial scene with bands like Skinny Puppy and Ministry, and eventually Nine Inch Nails. And then Coil's later work they refer to as their lunar phase, which was sort of more introspective and slow and mystical. And I have an example of that as well. And this phase of their career was really inspirational to the more atmospheric branch of post-industrial, like Raison d'Etre and the Haxon Club, and myself. But one of the things that was really distinctive about Coil was that more directly than any of the other first wave industrial groups, their experiences as gay men was one of the central themes that was common in their music. For instance, one of their early albums included the liner notes that this music is a ritual to harness homosexual Martian energy. In this case, Martian referring to in the astrological sense, not in kind of the science fiction sense. Queerness being a central theme in Coil's work was surprisingly not met with disdain or shock by mainstream press at the time, but that's because they simply ignored that aspect of their work in favor of focusing on the other subjects that the band was all about, which I feel like is an attitude that kind of darkly shadowed both England and the United States' response to the AIDS crisis at the time. Nick Soulsby, author of Everything Keeps Dissolving, Conversations with Coil, says, in the 1980s, with grotesque homophobia daily fodder for British tabloids, in which the British government was actively colluding with bigots to legislate in ways that insisted homosexuality and pedophilia were synonymous, which sounds really familiar, it was perhaps unsurprising that the early interviews averted their gaze from Coil's homosexuality. The effect was to not acknowledge the creative impact of queerness within Coil. There was no outing of Coil, nor a celebratory coming out, because they were simply calmly and contentedly gay in a way public figures were not meant to be during the 80s or indeed the 90s. Balance and Christofferson rejected the demand that they either embrace performative homosexuality or remain discreet and closeted. Soulsby continues, Coil's boldness is underrated. Their first music video was an AIDS parable accompanying a single raising money for the Terrence Higgins Trust, and they would contribute to a John Guierno compilation funding AIDS research. This is one of those instances where I'm having to control myself because I really just want to read you this whole article, but if you're interested in reading it yourself, it's called No Sex Please, We're British by Nick Soulsby. So queerness was a quintessential theme in Coil's music and was also intrinsically linked with the other themes that preoccupied their work, which were namely death, magic, transformation, and psychedelic drugs. And I believe this creates sort of an ideological through line that deeply links Coil with contemporary queer culture and music, because ask any queer person, if they're preoccupied with sex, death, magic, transformation, and or psychedelic drugs. I know I am. Earlier in this presentation, I referred to the first wave of industrial as the first noise scene, and what I mean by that is up until the emergence of this scene, experimental electronic music was mostly an academic pursuit or relegated to studios and concert halls. I think the first presenter was talking about how long it takes to make music on a computer, so that makes a lot of sense. And in the rare instances it was often sort of tangentially part of rock music, famously, Revolution 9 from the Beatles' White Album, or groups like Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. So the first wave of industrial was really the first time you began to see people performing experimental electronic music in a sort of DIY way, with many of the bands kind of building their own instruments or sharing the ones that they could afford to buy, and performing in homes and garages and basements, which is still pretty much identical to how the noise scenes work across the country today. So what happened? Like any underground movement that starts to gain traction with the dominant culture, in the late 90s and early 2000s, more mainstream artists started to kind of ape the aesthetics while ignoring the roots of the industrial movement, which is very similar to what happened with punk and hip hop and blues and jazz and techno and on and on and on. But I think the queer roots of industrial still live on. In this last decade or so, there's been a definitive resurgence of queer voices in experimental music spaces, and more sort of dance and rock oriented industrial adjacent music. There's groups like Health and the Pixel Grip, and the more experimental post-industrial scenes are just thriving with queer artists like Black Leather Jesus, Straight Panic, Lav Andula, of course Burial Woods, who played just before this presentation. There's also what they think of as sort of the next generation of artists from the first wave of industrial. I really love this story in particular. Stephen Thrower and Ossian Brown, who are a gay couple who met as members of Coil, went on to form their own group called Synclavier, who I think just released an album like 3 years ago. And we're also seeing a lot of queer people pioneering new branches of experimental music. One of the more notable artists I can think of is the late, great Sophie, and I'm going to play one of her songs. It's wide open. This might be really loud.
What? You might be loud.
Just be prepared.
Okay.
Lemonade, 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 lemonade. I have something to tell you. Hope you understand. I never meant to hurt you. Hold it in my hands. Just that when I'm with you, everything's okay. I get that peace and feeling.
So Sophie took abrasive and stark and sometimes very rude sounding sounds and used them to sort of subvert the aesthetics of pop music. Many of her songs overtly address gender fluidity and her experience as a trans woman, and she's credited with being one of the pioneers of a genre called hyperpop, which became very popular with queer youth. And so the final question is, what draws queer people to experimental music? And the answer is, I don't know. Unfortunately, I have no clear answers. I suspect that if you were to ask every queer artist what drew you to experimental music, there would be as many answers as there are ways of expressing yourself. And honestly, I'm sure some of the reasons those artists are drawn to experimental music is entirely divorced from them being queer. So I can only really speak to personal experience, so this is completely anecdotal. But in my experience, there are three factors that drew me, and perhaps other queer people, to the world of noise. The first factor is that the domineering conservative society that is openly hostile to LGBTQ people and that made the emergence of industrial crucial in the mid-70s is still clearly very much alive today. And that's become more obvious in the last decade or so. Perhaps coincidentally, noticeably in tandem with what I perceive as the reemergence of queer artists and experimental music. And I feel the impetus to engage with bizarre and outsider art is a form of refusal of that domineering culture. The second factor is that, from my experience, to grow up as a queer person is to grow up kind of questioning every kind of status quo. You realize there's no actual reason you have to love a particular kind of person. There's no actual reason a man has to be this and a woman has to be this. There's no reason you have to be either of those things. And that questioning in yourself and in your society leads to the questioning of absolutely everything. There's no reason I need to be any kind of way, then why would my art need to adhere to an existing form? Or in my case, it was kind of reversed. My art, my music can be anything, so why can't I? And the third thing that drew me to experimental music is just that I like it. And that's all I got. Thank you for your time.